The hook. Tank's arthritic fingers trembled as he held the manila envelope. The return address burned into his memory. Flanagan Documentary Productions, Chicago, IL. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same family name that had haunted his dreams for over 5 decades now wanted to resurrect the past. The old Louisville gym creaked around him in the pre-dawn darkness, leather-heavy bags swaying like hanged men in the shadows. Tank had arrived at 4 a.m., unable to sleep after staring at that envelope all night. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting intermittent darkness across faded newspaper clippings on the walls, most featuring a young, beautiful Muhammad Ali in his prime, none featuring Tank. He'd opened the package 3 times since yesterday, each viewing making his chest tighter. The letter inside was typed on expensive letterhead, signed by someone named Daniel Flanagan, filmmaker, grandson of Patrick Flanagan. The words were polite, professional, but Tank could read between the lines, "I know what you did. I know what you didn't do." "Mr. Washington," the letter began, "I'm producing a documentary about the untold stories of Muhammad Ali's exile years. I have reason to believe you possess unique insight into the events of March 17, 1967, specifically regarding my grandfather's establishment and a certain recording." Tank's reflection stared back at him from the gym's cracked mirror. 72 years old, face like weathered leather, hands that once moved like lightning now gnarled from arthritis and shame. The kids who trained here called him old school, thinking it was about his boxing style. They didn't know it meant he was from an era when black fighters had to choose between dignity and survival, and sometimes chose wrong. The gym's front door chimed. Tank stuffed the letter into his jacket pocket as Marcus Jr., his nephew, walked in carrying coffee and donuts. "Uncle Tank, you're here early even for you." Marcus Jr. set the breakfast on the front counter, studying his uncle's face. "You look like hell. Feel worse." Tank accepted the coffee gratefully, the warmth steadying his hands. "That filmmaker called again last night, left 3 messages. The one making the Ali documentary? That's good publicity for the gym, ain't it?" Tank almost laughed. Good publicity. If only the boy knew. Not that kind of documentary, nephew. Through the gym's windows, the West End was waking up. Same neighborhood where Tank and Ali, Cassius Clay then, had trained as kids. Same streets where they'd dreamed of championship belts and global fame. Ali had achieved both. Tank had achieved neither, but that wasn't what kept him awake at night. What kept him awake was the memory of rain on his windshield, the sound of his engine starting, the sight of Ali's broad shoulders disappearing into Flanagan's bar while Tank drove home to safety. "You never talk about him," Marcus Jr. said quietly. "About Ali. Everyone knows you two came up together, but you never... Some things better left buried." But even as Tank said it, he knew burial wasn't an option anymore. Daniel Flanagan had found the recording, the one Patrick Flanagan claimed didn't exist when reporters came sniffing around years later, the one that supposedly malfunctioned during the most infamous confrontation of the civil rights era. Tank remembered that night like a scar on his soul. Ali had called him at 9 p.m., voice tight with controlled fury. "They're saying I'm un-American, Tank. Saying I'm a coward for refusing the draft. I'm going to Flanagan's. Going to look them in the eye when they say it. Don't go, Cassius." Tank still called him by his birth name sometimes. "It's a setup. They want to humiliate you. Then come with me, brother. Stand with me." Tank had hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds that defined the rest of his life. "My promoter says I can't be seen taking sides. Political stuff, you understand." The silence on the other end lasted forever. "Yeah," Ali had finally said, "I understand perfectly." Now Tank understood too. Understood that courage wasn't about facing opponents in the ring. That was easy. Courage was about standing with your friend when the whole world was watching, when your own dreams hung in the balance, when doing right meant risking everything you'd worked for. Tank had failed that test spectacularly. The gym's phone rang, jarring him back to the present. Marcus Jr. answered, then held it out with a concerned expression. "Uncle Tank, it's for you. Says he's Daniel Flanagan." Tank stared at the receiver like it was a loaded gun. On the other end waited the grandson of the man who'd recorded his greatest shame. a filmmaker who somehow had footage of the night that changed everything, not just for Ali but for the coward who'd abandoned him. His hand shook as he reached for the phone. Some ghosts, he realized, don't stay buried just because you want them to. Sometimes they come back wearing the faces of the next generation, demanding answers you've spent a lifetime avoiding. This is Tank Washington. Mr. Washington, we need to talk. The voice on the other end was younger than Tank expected, carrying traces of Chicago polish that couldn't quite mask deeper Kentucky roots. Like his grandfather's accent, refined but never fully scrubbed clean. Mr. Washington, I appreciate you taking my call. I know this must be difficult. Tank pressed the receiver closer, aware of Marcus Jr. watching from across the gym. His nephew had inherited the family gift for reading tension in a room, useful when breaking up sparring sessions, dangerous when family secrets hung in the balance. Difficult's one word for it. Tank's voice came out rougher than intended. What exactly do you want, Mr. Flanagan? The truth. About March 17th, 1967. About what really happened at my grandfather's bar. Through the gym's front windows, Tank watched the morning shift at Henderson's Diner flip their sign to open. The same diner where he and Ali used to split breakfast after training. Back when the world felt infinite and their friendship unbreakable. Now the sight of those windows made his chest ache with the weight of ordinary moments lost forever. Your grandfather's been dead 20 years, Tank said. What makes you think? Because he left me something. Daniel's voice carried a filmmaker's patience, like he'd rehearsed this conversation. Boxes of recordings from the bar, business meetings, private conversations. Things he thought might be valuable someday. Tank's free hand found the worn spot on his jacket pocket where the letter had been living. And among them was a reel from that night. Hidden camera behind the bar. Everything that happened after Muhammad Ali walked through those doors. A pause. Everything that happened before. The gym seemed to contract around Tank. 56 years dissolving into nothing. He could smell the rain from that March evening, feel the steering wheel slick under his palms as he sat in his Buick across from Flanagan's, watching Ali's silhouette through the bar's frosted windows. I don't know what you think you have. I have you, Mr. Washington, in the parking lot, watching. For 23 minutes you sat in that car. Daniel's voice remained steady, professional, but Tank heard the underlying current. Not accusation exactly, but something sharper. Understanding, maybe, the kind that cut deeper than judgment. You were there. You saw him go in alone. Marcus Jr. had moved closer, ostensibly organizing hand wraps but clearly listening. The boy had grown up hearing whispers about his uncle's connection to the greatest, never understanding why Tank changed the subject whenever Ali's name surfaced in conversation. Now those whispers felt like prophecy. Everyone sees what they want to see. Tank managed. The camera doesn't lie, sir. Neither does audio. I have your phone conversation with Ali from earlier that evening. My grandfather recorded all the bar's incoming calls. Paranoid habit from his bootlegging days. Daniel paused, letting that sink in. I know he asked you to come. I know what you told him. Tank's reflection in the mirror across the gym looked ancient, hollowed out. 72 years old and still that coward from 1967, still choosing safety over solidarity. The kids who trained here saw a legend, former sparring partner of Muhammad Ali, trainer who developed 3 regional champions, keeper of old-school wisdom. They didn't see the fraud underneath. What do you want? Tank asked again, though he already knew. An interview, on camera. Your perspective on that night, on Ali's response to those men, on what happened after. The human story behind the legend, and if I say no, then I make the documentary without you. But the footage still exists. Your absence from that room still speaks volumes. History will draw its own conclusions about why Muhammad Ali's oldest friend wasn't beside him when he needed support most. The threat was delivered gently, wrapped in filmmaker politeness, but Tank felt its edges. Public humiliation at 72, his reputation shattered, the gym's legacy tainted. Worse, Marcus Jr. Learning the truth about his hero uncle, the man who'd raised him after his father died, who'd taught him to throw combinations and face adversity with dignity. I need time to think. Of course, but Mr. Washington. Daniel's voice softened slightly. I'm not my grandfather. This isn't about settling old scores or protecting family reputation. Ali deserves to have his full story told. All of it, even the parts that hurt. The line went dead. Tank held the receiver long enough for the dial tone to become accusatory, then hung up carefully. Marcus Jr. approached with the caution of someone reading dangerous weather. "Uncle Tank, everything all right?" Tank looked at his nephew, 28 years old, married last spring to a nurse from Shively, planning to take over the gym when Tank retired. A good man who believed his uncle was cut from the same cloth as the champions on those faded newspaper clippings. Just ghosts, nephew. Just old ghosts come calling. But as Tank watched Marcus Jr. return to his routine, straightening equipment with inherited precision, he realized the stakes weren't just his own reputation anymore. They never had been. Some betrayals echoed across generations, and some truths, once released, changed everything they touched. The morning light streaming through the windows felt like exposure, inciting incident. Tank stood frozen in that shaft of accusatory morning light, watching Marcus Jr. arrange speed bags with the methodical care of a man who believed in order, in the reliability of things. The phone call had ended, but Daniel Flanagan's voice lingered like smoke in the gym's stale air. "The footage still exists. Your absence still speaks volumes." The front door's chime announced the arrival of Tank's first student, Jerome Williams, 16 years old, all elbows and attitude, the kind of kid Tank had been training for 40 years. Jerome nodded respectfully and headed for the locker room, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space that suddenly felt too small to contain Tank's expanding dread. "Uncle Tank?" Marcus Jr.'s voice carried a note of concern that made Tank's chest tighten. "You sure you're all right? You look like you seen a ghost." Before Tank could deflect with another half-truth, the gym's landline rang again. 3 sharp bursts that seemed to slice through the morning's fragile normalcy. Marcus Jr. moved to answer it, but Tank's hand shot out, faster than his arthritic joints had moved in years. Let it ring. They stood there like boxers in a stare-down, uncle and nephew, while the phone continued its relentless demand. On the 4th ring, the ancient answering machine clicked to life. Tank's own voice, recorded decades ago when his optimism still outweighed his shame. "You've reached Washington's gym. Leave a message and we'll get back to champions in training." The beep echoed through the gym like a starting bell. "Mr. Washington, this is Daniel Flanagan again." The voice filled the space between them, impossible to ignore now. "I'm sorry to be persistent, but I'm flying to Louisville this afternoon. I'll be at the Galt House downtown. I think there's something you need to see before you make your decision about the interview." Tank felt Marcus Jr.'s eyes boring into him, reading the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw had locked tight. The boy had always been perceptive, a survival skill inherited from growing up in a neighborhood where reading danger kept you alive. "I have a photograph," Daniel continued, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone defusing a bomb. "Not from the bar footage. This one's from 1965. You and Ali after his second fight with Sonny Liston. You're both laughing about something, arms around each other's shoulders. Brothers. I found it in my grandfather's personal effects, and I think..." A pause, heavy with unspoken implications. "I think he kept it for a reason. Maybe as insurance, maybe as evidence of what was lost that night in 1967. The machine's tape continued turning, capturing Daniel's breathing, the distant sound of Chicago traffic through his hotel window. Tank found himself holding his own breath, as if silence could somehow prevent the next words from reaching Marcus Jr.'s ears. "The thing is, Mr. Washington, I don't think you were a coward. I think you were afraid. There's a difference. The footage shows a man wrestling with an impossible choice, not someone who didn't care. But only you can tell that story properly. Only you can explain what friendship looked like in 1967 for 2 black men caught between principle and survival." Tank's knees threatened to buckle. The photograph Daniel described lived in his memory like a scar. Him and Ali outside the old Columbia gym, both of them young and bulletproof, convinced their bond could weather any storm. Ali had just knocked out Liston, with what reporters called a phantom punch, and they'd been celebrating the mystery of it, the beautiful audacity of being champions in a world that insisted they couldn't be. "I'll be at the hotel until tomorrow morning," Daniel concluded. "Room 412. I hope you'll come." Not for the documentary, for Ali, for the truth he deserves to have told. The line went dead. The gym fell silent except for the whisper of leather bags swaying from Jerome's practice routine in the back corner. Marcus Jr. stood motionless, his face cycling through confusion, concern, and something that looked dangerously like understanding. "Uncle Tank," he said slowly, "what happened in 1967? Tank stared at his nephew. This good man who'd inherited not just the gym but the weight of a family name built on stories of honor and courage. Stories Tank had allowed him to believe because the truth was too toxic to share. But now Daniel Flanagan had arrived with his cameras and his grandfather's recordings, preparing to excavate everything Tank had spent 56 years burying. The morning light streaming through the windows no longer felt like exposure. It felt like Judgment Day. "Sit down, nephew," Tank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's time I told you about the night I let down the greatest man I ever knew." As Marcus Jr. settled onto the worn bench beside the ring, Tank realized there was no going back now. The earthquake had started, and all he could do was try to control the damage as his carefully constructed world came crashing down around them both. Early development. Tank's mouth opened, then closed. The words that had lived poisonous in his chest for 56 years suddenly felt too heavy to lift, too jagged to speak without cutting his throat on the way out. Marcus Jr. sat expectant on the bench, hands folded like he was waiting for another training story about footwork or combinations, not the confession that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about the man who'd raised him. "Uncle Tank?" Marcus Jr.'s voice carried the patience of someone accustomed to coaxing truth from reluctant teenagers. "Whatever it is, we can handle it." But Tank was already shaking his head, backing away from the bench like it had caught fire. No, this ain't the time. Jerome's here for his session, and Mrs. Patterson's bringing her grandson at 10, and Uncle Tank. The firmness in his nephew's voice stopped Tank mid-retreat. Marcus Jr. had stood up, his expression shifting from concern to something harder, the look of a man who'd inherited more than just a boxing gym, who'd absorbed 3 decades of unanswered questions and half-finished stories about his uncle's mysterious past. "I've been waiting my whole life for this conversation," Marcus Jr. said quietly. "Every time someone mentions Ali around you, you get that look. Same look you got right now, like you're drowning in something you can't name." Tank's hands found the familiar sanctuary of busy work, adjusting already straight ropes, reorganizing gloves that didn't need organizing. Some stones better left unturned, nephew. Not this one. The certainty in those 3 words hit Tank like a body shot. He turned to face his nephew fully, seeing not the boy he'd taught to throw his first punch, but a man who'd been reading the silences between Tank's war stories, cataloging the careful way Tank changed subjects whenever certain names surfaced. From the back of the gym came the rhythmic thud of Jerome working the heavy bag, lost in his own world of controlled violence. The sound usually centered Tank, reminded him of his purpose here, shaping young fighters, teaching them discipline and respect. Now it felt like a countdown, each punch marking time until everything he'd built came crashing down. "You don't understand what you're asking," Tank said. "Then, help me understand." Tank looked toward the front windows, where Louisville's morning traffic was building toward rush hour. Somewhere out there, Daniel Flanagan was boarding a plane, carrying his grandfather's secrets and his filmmaker's hunger for truth. By afternoon, he'd be at the Galt house with his photograph and his footage, waiting for Tank to walk into the same trap he'd been avoiding for half a century. The gym's phone rang again. Both men froze, staring at the machine like it might explode. Tank felt Marcus Jr.'s eyes on him, reading the way his shoulders tensed, how his breathing had gone shallow and quick. On the 4th ring, the machine clicked over. "Tank? Tank, you there? It's Jimmy Corbett." Tank's blood turned to ice water. Jimmy Corbett, 78 years old, former promoter, one of the last men alive who remembered 1967 in detail, who remembered the phone calls and backroom conversations, the careful choreography of a boxing career derailed by politics and cowardice. "Listen, Tank, I've been getting calls. Reporter from Chicago. Says he's doing some documentary about Ali, asking about you, about that business at Flanagan's bar." Jimmy's voice carried the weight of old secrets, the careful neutrality of a man who'd spent decades protecting the wrong people. Figure you ought to know he's sniffing around. Might want to clarify some things before he gets the wrong idea." The line went dead. The gym fell silent except for Jerome's continued assault on the heavy bag and the sound of Tank's world shifting on its axis. Marcus Jr. was staring at him with undisguised shock, pieces falling into place behind his eyes. "Jimmy Corbett," Marcus Jr. said slowly. "He was your promoter back in the day. Why would he be warning you about—" He stopped, understanding flooding his features. "Uncle Tank, what did you do?" Tank wanted to run, wanted to walk out those front doors and keep walking until Louisville was just a memory, until the weight of Marcus Jr.'s disappointment couldn't find him. Instead, he found himself sinking onto the bench his nephew had vacated, his 72-year-old body suddenly feeling ancient. "I didn't do nothing," he whispered. That was the problem. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire, acrid and inescapable. Marcus Jr. remained standing, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked dangerously like pity. "The night Ali went to Flanagan's," Tank continued, the words coming unbidden now, "he asked me to go with him, asked me to stand with him when those white boys tried to humiliate him for refusing the draft. And?" Tank met his nephew's eyes, seeing his own reflections staring back. Older, more broken, carrying the weight of a choice that had poisoned everything that came after. "And I chose my career over my friend." The silence that followed Tank's confession felt dense as concrete, pressing down on both men until even breathing became deliberate work. Marcus Jr. remained frozen, his face cycling through emotions too quickly for Tank to read. Disappointment, anger, something that might have been grief for the uncle he thought he knew. "You chose your career," Marcus Jr. repeated, his voice flat as old beer. "Over Muhammad Ali." Tank flinched at hearing it spoken back to him, the words stripped of context and cushioning. "It wasn't that simple, wasn't it?" Marcus Jr.'s voice cracked like a whip. "Your best friend asks you to stand with him when he's taking the hardest stand of his life, and you said no because it might hurt your boxing career. You don't know what it was like then." Tank's hands worked against each other, arthritic knuckles grinding like broken glass. The Boxing Commission was already looking for reasons to strip licenses from fighters who got political. "Jimmy Corbett told me—" "Jimmy Corbett." Marcus Jr. spat the name like poison. "So you let your white promoter decide whether you'd support your black brother." The accusation hit Tank square in the chest, stealing his breath. Because that's exactly what he'd done, wasn't it? Chosen the safety of Jimmy's promises over the uncertainty of standing with Ali. Chosen the illusion of career protection over the reality of friendship. "I was 28 years old," Tank said, but the words sounded pathetic even to him. "I had a shot at the regional title. Jimmy said if I got involved with Ali's draft resistance, the commission would find ways to keep me from fighting. Said I'd end up like Ali, banned, broke, forgotten. And instead you ended up what? A has-been running a gym in the West End, carrying this poison for 56 years? Marcus Jr. paced now, his movements sharp with barely contained fury. "Jesus Christ, Uncle Tank, I grew up thinking you were somebody, thinking I came from something." Each word landed like a body shot. Tank watched his nephew pace the length of the ring, this man he'd helped raise, who'd looked up to him with the kind of hero worship Tank had never deserved. The gym around them, their family legacy, the monument to everything Marcus Jr. thought they represented, suddenly felt like a mausoleum. From the back corner, Jerome's punching routine had stopped. The boy stood frozen by the heavy bag, pretending not to hear but absorbing every word. Tank realized this conversation was destroying more than just his relationship with Marcus Jr. It was contaminating the sacred space he'd spent decades building, the place where young fighters came to learn about courage and integrity. "You want to know what happened that night?" Tank's voice came out raw, desperate. "You want the whole truth?" Marcus Jr. stopped pacing, turned to face him with eyes that held no forgiveness. "I want to understand how the man who taught me to never back down from a fight spent his whole life running from one." Tank felt something fracture inside his chest. Not his heart, but something deeper. The careful compartment where he'd locked away March 15, 1967, suddenly burst open like a broken dam. "Ali called me at 7 o'clock that evening. Said he was going to Flanagan's bar, said those white boys had been talking shit about him all week, calling him coward for refusing the draft, said they didn't understand the difference between cowardice and courage, and he was going to educate them. Tank's voice grew steadier as the memory took hold, details sharp as yesterday. Asked me to come with him. Said it would mean everything to have his sparring partner there, his friend. Marcus Jr.'s expression had shifted from anger to something more complex, still hurt, but listening now. I told him I couldn't. Made up some excuse about training, about needing rest before my fight the next month. But the truth was, Jimmy had gotten to me. Filled my head with fear about what supporting Ali would cost me. Tank looked down at his hands, these hands that had thrown 10,000 punches alongside Ali, that had helped him prepare for Liston and Patterson and all the others. So I sat in my car across from Flanagan's and watched him walk in alone. 23 minutes I sat there, watching through those frosted windows while my best friend faced down a room full of racist drunks by himself. What happened inside? Marcus Jr.'s voice was quieter now, professional curiosity overriding personal hurt. I don't know. The admission felt like glass in Tank's throat. I drove away before it was over. Couldn't watch anymore, couldn't live with what I was doing, but couldn't make myself do different either. Marcus Jr. sank onto the bench beside Tank, the fight going out of him. And now this filmmaker has footage of all of it. Everything. Tank nodded. My cowardice, Ali's courage, the whole ugly truth I've been hiding since before you were born. They sat in silence. Two men surrounded by the ghosts of champions who'd fought for more than just titles. Tank could feel the weight of every trophy on the walls, every photograph of fighters who'd found their courage when it mattered most. Everything he'd taught Marcus Jr. about honor and integrity suddenly felt like lies built on the foundation of his own betrayal. The morning light streaming through the windows had turned harsh, unforgiving. Somewhere across town, Daniel Flanagan's plane was touching down, carrying the past Tank could no longer outrun. Tank stared at the gym floor, counting cracks in the concrete he'd memorized over 30 years of avoiding this moment. The silence stretched between him and Marcus Jr. like a chasm too wide to bridge, until the landline shattered it again. This time Marcus Jr. moved faster, snatching the receiver before Tank could stop him. Washington's gym. Tank watched his nephew's face transform as he listened, color draining from his cheeks like water from a broken basin. Marcus Jr.'s eyes found Tank's across the gym, wide with something between shock and accusation. Yes, he's here, Marcus Jr. said slowly. Hold on. He held out the phone. It's for you. Says his name is Muhammad Ali Jr. The world tilted sideways. Tank's hand trembled as he took the receiver, muscle memory from 1,000 conversations with the champion's son over the decades. Conversations that had grown shorter and more stilted as the years accumulated their weight of unspoken truths. Tank? The voice on the other end carried his father's cadence but none of his warmth. We need to talk. Junior. Tank's throat felt packed with sand. How you been? Cut the pleasantries. Some filmmakers been calling around, asking questions about March 15th, 1967. Asking about you and my father. A pause that felt like forever. Asking about Flanagan's bar. Tank's knees buckled. He gripped the phone tighter, aware that Marcus Jr. was reading every micro-expression, cataloging every tell. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he knows more than he's saying. The kind that made me think, maybe it's time I learned what really happened that night. Ali Jr.'s voice carried a edge Tank had never heard before. Sharp, unforgiving. Because I've been wondering my whole life why my father's best friend disappeared right when he needed him most. The words hit Tank like an uppercut to the solar plexus. All these years he'd assumed Ali had protected him, had kept the truth of his cowardice from his family. The careful fiction Tank had constructed, that their friendship had simply faded due to distance and circumstances, crumbled like ancient paper. Junior, listen. No, you listen. This filmmaker Flanagan, he says his grandfather recorded everything. Says he has footage of my father walking into that bar alone, facing down a room full of racists who'd been waiting to humiliate him. And you know what else he has, Tank? Tank's vision blurred. What? Footage of you sitting in your car outside, watching. For 23 minutes, he said. 23 minutes of you deciding whether your career was worth more than your friend. The phone slipped from Tank's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the gym floor. Marcus Jr. dove to retrieve it, but the line had gone dead, leaving only the dial tone's accusatory hum. Tank stared at his nephew, seeing his own horror reflected back. He knew, Tank whispered. Allie knew I was there. Knew I watched him go in alone. Uncle Tank. All these years I thought maybe he never saw me. Never knew how close I came to doing the right thing before I drove away like a coward. Tank's voice cracked like old leather, but he knew. He watched me choose my career over his life, and he never said nothing. Never told his son what kind of man his Uncle Tank really was. The revelation rewrote everything. Every Christmas card from Ali's family, every stilted phone conversation with Ali Jr., every carefully orchestrated encounter over the decades. It hadn't been forgiveness or forgetfulness. It had been Ali protecting Tank from the consequences of his own betrayal, even after Tank had abandoned him in his darkest hour. Marcus Jr. knelt beside Tank's chair, his earlier anger replaced by something more complicated. Maybe that's why he never said anything. Maybe he understood. Understood what? Tank's voice exploded through the gym. That when the moment came to stand up for what's right, I chose what was safe. That I let a white promoter convince me my comfort was worth more than his courage? Jerome had stopped pretending not to listen. The teenager stood frozen by the heavy bag, witnessing the destruction of everything he'd believed about the man he'd looked up to. Tank forced himself to meet Jerome's eyes across the gym. You hearing this, son? You hearing about the kind of man been teaching you about honor and integrity? But Jerome didn't look disgusted or disappointed. He looked heartbroken, like he was watching his grandfather die. Mr. Tank, Jerome said quietly, what are you going to do now? The question hung in the air like incense, sacred and suffocating. Tank looked around the gym, at the photographs of champions he'd trained, at the trophies representing everything he'd built on the foundation of his greatest failure, at the nephew whose respect he'd just incinerated with the truth. Somewhere across town, Daniel Flanagan was checking into the Galt house with his grandfather's footage and his terrible gift of revelation. By evening, the whole world would know what Tank had spent 56 years hiding from himself. The reckoning he'd avoided for half a century was finally here, and there was nowhere left to run. Tank stared at Jerome for a long moment, the boy's question echoing in the sudden stillness of the gym. What was he going to do now? The same question that had paralyzed him in 1967, sitting in his car while his best friend walked alone into a room full of hate. I don't know, son, Tank said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been running from this for so long I forgot how to stand still. The phone rang again, sharp and insistent. This time nobody moved. They let it ring until the machine picked up, all three of them frozen like they were waiting for judgment from on high. Mr. Washington, this is Daniel Flanagan. I'm at the Galt House Hotel, room 412. I think we should meet tonight before my screening tomorrow. There are things in this footage you need to see, things that might change how you remember that night. The machine clicked off, leaving silence thick as smoke. Tank felt something shift in his chest, a loosening he hadn't experienced in decades. The secret was out now, bleeding into the light whether he wanted it or not. The careful wall he'd built around March 15, 1967, had finally crumbled completely. Things that might change how you remember, Marcus Jr. repeated slowly. What does that mean? Tank shook his head, but somewhere deep in his memory, doubt began to creep in like water through a crack. What exactly had he seen that night? He'd been so consumed by his own shame, so focused on his cowardice, that the details had blurred over the years into a single narrative of betrayal. I need to call Tommy Morrison, Tank said suddenly. He was working the door at Flanagan's that night. If anybody knows what really happened inside... Tommy Morrison's been dead 15 years, Marcus Jr. said gently. Tank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of all the witnesses who'd carried pieces of that night to their graves. How many perspectives had been buried with them? How many truths had he never bothered to seek because he was so certain of his own guilt? Jerome cleared his throat, the sound fragile in the heavy air. Mr. Tank, can I ask you something? Tank nodded, not trusting his voice. You said Mr. Ali never held it against you, that he kept protecting you even after what happened. Don't that tell you something about what kind of man he was? The question hit Tank sideways, approaching his shame from an angle he'd never considered. In all his years of self-recrimination, he'd focused so intently on his own failure that he'd never fully absorbed the magnitude of Ali's grace. The champion had spent 40 years shielding Tank from consequences Tank had convinced himself he deserved. Why would he do that? Tank asked, more to himself than to anyone else. Why protect somebody who abandoned him? Maybe, Jerome said carefully, because he understood something you don't. Before Tank could respond, the gym's front door chimed. All three men turned to see a figure silhouetted against the afternoon light, tall, wearing a suit that looked expensive enough to pay the gym's rent for 3 months. As the man stepped inside, Tank's breath caught. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same angular features as Old Man Flanagan, but softened somehow. Same pale eyes, but without the hard cruelty Tank remembered from his few encounters with the bar owner. This had to be Daniel Flanagan, arriving earlier than expected, carrying his grandfather's legacy and his own filmmaker's hunger for truth. Mr. Washington? Daniel's voice was softer than Tank had imagined, almost apologetic. I'm sorry to intrude, but I thought we should meet somewhere comfortable for you. Somewhere that feels safe. Tank stood slowly, his knees protesting after the morning's emotional violence. He studied Daniel's face, looking for traces of the man who'd owned Flanagan's bar, who'd created the space where everything had gone wrong. But all he saw was nervous energy and something that looked like genuine respect. You got your grandfather's footage with you? Tank asked. Daniel nodded, patting a leather satchel at his side. Everything, the whole evening, from multiple angles. My grandfather was thorough. Multiple angles, Marcus Jr. repeated. You mean there's more than one camera? 3 cameras, Daniel confirmed. One behind the bar, one by the front window, one in the back corner. Grandfather was paranoid about documentation, about protecting himself legally if anything went wrong. He paused, meeting Tank's eyes directly. Mr. Washington, I need you to understand something. What I've seen in this footage, it's not what you think. It's not what anyone thinks. Tank felt the world tilt again, but differently this time. Not the sickening lurch of exposure, but something else. The vertigo that comes from realizing you've been looking at something upside down for half a century. What do you mean? Tank's voice came out hoarse. Daniel Flanagan opened his satchel, withdrawing an old film canister with hands that trembled slightly. I mean, Muhammad Ali wasn't alone that night. And neither were you. Tank's hand shot out instinctively, gripping the edge of the boxing ring, as Daniel's words rewrote 56 years of self-hatred in a single sentence. The film canister in the young man's hands looked impossibly small to contain the weight of truth Tank had been carrying alone. What are you talking about? Marcus Jr. stepped forward, journalist instincts overriding family drama. What do you mean he wasn't alone? Daniel set the canister on the nearby bench with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. My grandfather installed those cameras because he was terrified of lawsuits, of accusations. He recorded everything that happened in his establishment. He looked directly at Tank, and his pale eyes held something that might have been kindness, including what happened before Muhammad Ali walked through that door. Tank's vision blurred at the edges. I don't understand. The footage shows you sitting in your car for 23 minutes, yes. But it also shows what you couldn't see from that angle. Daniel's voice grew steadier, more confident. It shows 3 other cars parked in the alley behind Flanagan's. It shows Bundini Brown getting out of one of them. It shows Angelo Dundee from another. And from the third, the gym went silent except for the sound of Tank's labored breathing. Jerome had moved closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of revelation. From the third car, Daniel continued, it shows Muhammad Ali Sr. getting out and walking to the back entrance. Mr. Washington, Muhammad Ali was never alone in that bar. His whole corner was there, positioned around the building, and they all knew you were out front. Tank's knees buckled. Marcus Jr. caught his arm, lowering him onto the bench beside the film canister that contained the death of everything Tank thought he knew about the worst night of his life. That's impossible, Tank whispered. I would have seen them. I would have known. You were watching the front door, consumed by your own decision. Daniel's voice carried no judgment, only the gentle authority of documented fact. But the camera by the front window caught everything. You sitting in your car, clearly in distress. You getting out 3 different times, walking halfway to the door, then returning to your car. He was trying, Jerome said quietly, understanding flooding his young face. You were trying to go in. Tank stared at the canister, afraid to hope, afraid to release the poison he'd been drinking for decades. But I didn't. I drove away. Yes, Daniel agreed. But not when you think. The timestamp on the footage shows you leaving at 9:47 p.m. Muhammad Ali emerged from Flanagan's bar at 9:52 p.m. He paused, letting the mathematics of redemption sink in. You weren't there to see his legendary response to the crowd, the moment that became part of his mythology. But you were there for everything that mattered before it. The pieces of Tank's fractured memory began rearranging themselves into a completely different picture. All these years he'd believed he'd abandoned Ali during his moment of greatest need. But the truth was more complex, more forgiving, more human. Why didn't anybody tell me? Tank's voice cracked with the weight of unnecessary decades. Why didn't Ali say something? Why didn't Bundini or Angelo? Because, Daniel said gently, according to the audio we recovered, Muhammad Ali specifically told them not to. The camera by the window picked up his voice when he came out of the bar that night. He saw your car was gone and said, "Tank's carrying enough weight, don't need to add this to it." Tank felt something break open in his chest, not the devastating crack of exposed shame, but the slow, painful healing of a bone that had been set wrong for half a century. Ali had known, had seen Tank's struggle, his partial courage, his human limitation, and had chosen to protect him not just from the world's judgment, but from the truth that might have eased his guilt. He let me hate myself, Tank said in wonder, to save me from feeling like I hadn't tried. Marcus Jr. sank down beside his uncle, the anger from earlier replaced by something like awe. He gave you the harder gift, the one that let you keep teaching young fighters about courage. Tank looked at Jerome, at this young man who'd been watching his hero crumble and rebuild in real time. Son, you understand what this means? All those lessons about getting back up, about facing your failures, I've been teaching them to myself as much as to you. Jerome nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Means you've been practicing courage every day for 56 years, even when you thought you didn't deserve to. Tank reached for the film canister with shaking hands, this small container that held the absolution he'd never sought because he'd been so certain he didn't deserve it. Outside, Louisville carried on its daily business, unaware that in a small gym in the West End, a man was finally learning the difference between abandoning a friend and being human in an impossible moment. The truth had found him at last, and it was more merciful than he'd ever dared imagine. Daniel Flanagan watched quietly, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred, the resurrection of a man who had been buried alive by his own guilt. The afternoon light filtering through the gym's dusty windows caught the tears on Tank's cheeks, transforming them into something precious. What happens now? Marcus Jr. asked softly, his voice barely disturbing the sanctified air. Tank looked up at his nephew, then at Jerome, then at Daniel, 3 generations connected by this moment of grace. Now I remember how to breathe, he said, and his voice carried a lightness it hadn't held in half a century. He stood slowly, setting the canister on the bench with the reverence it deserved. Walking to the center of the gym, Tank turned in a slow circle, seeing everything with new eyes. The faded photographs on the walls weren't monuments to hypocrisy anymore. They were evidence of a man who had spent decades teaching what he desperately needed to learn himself. Every young fighter he'd trained to get back up after being knocked down had been practice for this moment, learning to forgive himself for being human. Jerome, Tank called gently. Come here, son. The teenager approached cautiously, still processing the transformation he'd witnessed. Tank placed both hands on Jerome's shoulders, studying the young man's face with the intensity of someone seeing clearly for the first time in decades. You've been watching me teach you about courage, about integrity, about standing up when it matters, Tank said. What you saw today, that wasn't those lessons being lies, that was those lessons being born. Jerome's eyes filled with understanding that seemed too deep for his 17 years. "You've been teaching us how to live with our failures." "More than that," Tank said. "I've been teaching you that courage ain't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every day, even when you think you don't deserve to." He turned to Marcus Jr., seeing his nephew's face soften with something that looked like pride. "Junior, you asked me earlier what kind of man I am. Truth is, I'm the kind of man who makes mistakes, who gets scared, who sometimes chooses wrong. But I'm also the kind of man who keeps showing up, keeps trying to do better, keeps believing that tomorrow might be the day I finally get it right." Marcus Jr. nodded slowly. "That's the only kind of man worth being, Uncle Tank." Daniel Flanagan cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Washington, there's something else. Something I found in my grandfather's papers." He reached into his satchel again, withdrawing a yellowed envelope. "It's a letter from Muhammad Ali, written in 1970, during his exile. He gave it to my grandfather with instructions to deliver it to you if you ever came asking questions about that night." Tank's hands trembled as he accepted the envelope. His name was written across it in Ali's distinctive handwriting, the letters bold and confident even in 1970, when the champion's world was crumbling around him. "He knew," Tank whispered. "He knew I'd come looking for the truth someday." "Maybe," Daniel said. "Or maybe he just knew that truth has a way of finding us when we're ready to receive it." Tank slipped his finger under the envelope's flap, feeling it give way after decades of waiting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and Ali's words reached across time to complete a conversation that had been interrupted 56 years ago. "Tank, if you reading this, it means you finally ready to stop punishing yourself for being human. You think you let me down that night, but brother, you've been holding me up ever since. Every young fighter you teach to get back up, every lesson about courage you pass on, every day you show up at that gym trying to be better than you was yesterday, that's you fighting for me in ways that matter more than one night ever could. You sat in that car for 23 minutes because you was wrestling with your conscience. That ain't cowardice, brother. That's courage trying to be born. Stop carrying my weight. I can handle my own. Your friend always." Muhammad Tank folded the letter carefully, pressing it against his chest as the last of his ancient anger finally dissolved. Around him, the gym seemed to expand, as if the walls themselves were exhaling after holding their breath for half a century. Outside, Louisville continued its eternal rhythm, unaware that in a small boxing gym in the West End, a man had finally learned the difference between abandoning a friend and being beautifully, forgivably human. The truth hadn't just set him free, it had revealed that he'd been carrying keys to his own prison all along. He was Tank Washington, former heavyweight contender, trainer of champions, Muhammad Ali's sparring partner and friend. And for the first time in 56 years, that was enough.